There was something different in the sky that morning. The clouds seemed to breathe, and the wind whispered as if carrying an ancient warning. In distant regions, rivers changed color. In others, animals migrated to places they should never have been. An eclipse, unpredicted, covered the sun for minutes longer than it should have, but no one spoke about it. No one wanted to see. Only now, it's no longer possible to ignore. Because what began as a whisper in the air has turned into an evident sign. Something supernatural is already in motion, and 2025 will be the point of no return. It all started with the clocks, small glitches almost imperceptible that soon spread like a silent fever. At different points across the planet, thousands of people reported their alarm clocks ringing a few minutes early. Digital devices lagged or sped up without explanation, and even atomic clocks, considered the most precise on Earth, began showing tiny but real fluctuations. Scientists tried to explain it. They blamed solar storms, magnetic interference, technical failures. But deep down, there was unease in their eyes, as if they were no longer so certain they could control time, as if time somehow was being tampered with. But that was just the beginning. On January 29, 2025, a stain appeared in the sky over the Middle East. It wasn't an ordinary cloud, nor a storm. It was too dark, too still. Planes rerouted their paths. Satellites recorded the phenomenon, but the videos leaked for only a short time before mysteriously vanishing from the internet. Those who saw it described it as a pulsing shadow that seemed to watch, not merely hover. Some said they felt dizzy. Others cried without knowing why. That night, old rabbis in Jerusalem said they saw ancient signs repeating in the heavens, similar to the days that preceded the destruction of the Second Temple. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, in an isolated village in Indonesia, a child was born with a glowing mark on her back, a symbol shaped like an eye, which briefly shone every time she slept. Her parents considered 1,000 explanations: a genetic condition, a cruel trick of nature, a curse. But no theory explained what happened 7 days later when the mark vanished and the girl began to speak in ancient Hebrew. She had never heard the language, and yet she recited passages from the book of Daniel with flawless pronunciation. These episodes, so distant and distinct, began to form an invisible web, a pattern, something bigger, but the world moved on. The media ignored it. Government stayed silent until the sound came. It was in February, a muffled roar, as if the planet itself had let out a lament. It started in the Arctic. Seismic monitoring stations recorded vibrations coming from the depths of the Earth. There was no earthquake, no tectonic plates shifting, but something was stirring in the core. The sound spread to Canada, then to Russia, then to Brazil, all different but with the same frequency. 7.83 hertz, the Schumann frequency, the natural vibration of the Earth. Only now, it was trembling. Spiritualists said the planet was awakening. Scientists remained silent, but ancient writings had already spoken of this day. In Ezekiel 38, there's a mention of a great tremor that would precede the gathering of nations. In Revelation, John speaks of voices, thunders, and earthquakes before the opening of the seals. And among scholars of biblical prophecy, a growing sense emerged that the signs were finally connecting. But of course, most people laughed at it. They called it coincidence. Mass hysteria, another religious delusion. Until a partial eclipse, predicted for March 25th, lasted 4 minutes longer than expected. That shouldn't have been possible. And yet, thousands of astronomical observers reported the same phenomenon. The sun seemed stopped, as if it hesitated to continue its course, as if something invisible were holding time. In Rome, the bell of St. Peter's Basilica rang 3 times on its own during that eclipse. In Jerusalem, live cameras captured a bright light hovering over the Western Wall. And in Japan, a Buddha statue shed tears, not once, but twice, in front of tourists and pilgrims. No satisfactory explanation was offered. But in secret internet forums, theologians, mystics, and even retired military personnel began sharing reports, maps with zones of altered energy, documents pointing to a spiritual reorganization of the Earth, and even a prophecy dated 1904, predicting that in 2025 the openings would be seen in the sky and the guarded creatures would awaken. Perhaps the most alarming point was the Euphrates River. Known for being mentioned in the Book of Revelation as the place where 4 fallen angels are bound, the river began drying up at an accelerated pace. This had been happening for years, but in 2025 it practically vanished in some areas. And then, caves appeared. Excavations uncovered ancient structures, and witnesses said they heard sounds coming from within. Sounds of chains, of footsteps, and even of voices. Voices that didn't belong to any known language. But that sent chills through everyone who heard them. Archaeologists tried to contain the commotion. They said it was the echo of the wind. But a sound engineer who analyzed one of the recordings confided, "That has form. It has intent. It's not noise. It's speech. It's command." And strangely, the frequencies of those voices also vibrated at 783 hertz. Meanwhile, in dreams scattered across the world, people reported the same scene. A red sky, a hooded figure pointing east, and a crowd kneeling before a light growing on the horizon. People who had never met, from different cultures, different languages, but with the same dream. An Israeli rabbi, a Buddhist monk, and a Pentecostal woman from rural Bahia described the exact same details, as if the dream had been transmitted. But the most unsettling thing wasn't the content of those dreams, but the date, April 17th, 2025. They all dreamed of that specific day. No one knew why, but the date was there, clear, etched in stone, tattooed on the subconscious. It was like a collective warning, but still silent. Then the manifestations began in the children. At a school in Germany, 5 students wrote the same sentence during an activity. "He is at the door." And in Guatemala, a 7-year-old girl stopped in the middle of recess, looked at the sky and said, "The last seal will be broken soon." And in the United States, a newborn baby cried every night at the same time, 3:33 a.m. every night, without fail. Too much symbolism to be coincidence? Perhaps. But it's in this interweaving of signs, in this whisper between events, that what we call prophecy resides. Because prophecy isn't a sudden explosion of the future. It's a subtle alignment of pieces that fit together until they form a picture that can no longer be ignored. And that picture is forming now, before our eyes. Because if we look closely, we'll see that something supernatural has already begun. And 2025 isn't the start. It's the turning point, the fold in time, the invisible line between what was merely symbolic and what is beginning to become real. And then came the silence. Not the usual silence of calm nights, but a thick silence that hung in the air like an invisible presence. Entire cities reported moments when sound seemed to be sucked out of reality, as if the world itself were holding its breath. In London, birds stopped singing for exactly 11 minutes. In a village in the Andes, the church bells didn't echo, even when struck hard. And on the African coast, fishermen said the sea, for a brief moment, stopped moving. No waves, no breeze, just emptiness. A sonic abyss, as if something were about to cross the threshold between worlds. That same day, a woman in Damascus fell into a trance and began writing an endless sequence of symbols. It wasn't a known language, but ancient scholars recognized the structure as similar to Enochian script, the supposed language of the angels. The strangest part, when read in a mirror, one of the phrases could be translated as, "They are already here, and they know your name." That kind of phrase would usually be dismissed as hysteria, but 2025 wasn't an ordinary year, because soon after the disappearances began. not of people, but of stars. Amateur astronomers noticed that certain stars, visible for centuries in fixed constellations, began to flicker, weaken, vanish. It wasn't fog, nor equipment failure. They simply ceased to exist. The star Betelgeuse, for instance, started emitting a pulsing glow, alternating between deep red and bluish white. An unprecedented phenomenon. Some believed it was about to explode into a supernova. Others said it was revealing itself. A mystical rabbi from Safed wrote in his journal, "When the firmament is undone and the candles of the sky extinguished, the Messiah will come through the invisible opening between worlds." And though it seemed just another enigmatic phrase, something about it made sense, as if the sky, always a static ceiling, were becoming a door. Meanwhile, in the mountains of Iran, an expedition found a manuscript wrapped in resin, protected by a marble box buried in layers of rock. Dating placed it over 3,000 years old. The content? A narrative nearly identical to the Revelation of John, but with elements missing from the traditional biblical version. The text spoke of a double harvest and bearers of black light, beings who would walk among men appearing ordinary, but whose eyes would reflect the stars that had vanished. Reports of encounters with people who didn't seem like people began to spread. Individuals with gazes too fixed, voices slightly out of sync with their lip movements, people who didn't blink. In Buenos Aires, a psychologist reported that 3 different patients described the same lucid dream about a woman in white, who said, "The countdown is ending." None of them knew each other, and none had a history of psychotic episodes. And then came the blood. In at least 9 rivers around the world, the waters turned red for a day. It wasn't industrial pollution. There were no heavy metals. Analyses found no algae or bacteria, just blood, human blood, not in large quantities, but enough to spark terror. In southern India, a fisherman said the waters smelled of iron and clamor. In Mexico, the Red River appeared beside a farm where that same dawn, 144 lambs were born with a cross-shaped mark on their backs. Yes, 144. The coincidence with the number of the sealed in Revelation didn't go unnoticed. And when the Vatican was questioned, a cardinal simply replied, "Not all signs are meant to be interpreted. Some are meant to be feared." Amid this chaos, Mount Sinai trembled. Literally, there was no earthquake around it, just the mountain. The rocks cracked. A pillar of smoke rose to the sky, and for 7 minutes, a pulsing light was recorded by orbiting satellites, right at the summit, where, according to tradition, Moses received the tablets of the law. Witnesses at the site reported hearing a deep, almost guttural sound, as if something ancient were awakening in the mountain's heart. But no one dared climb, not out of fear of the rock, but because of an instinctive feeling that it was no longer just stone, that it was now a throne. And thrones, as is well known, are not occupied by chance. Soon after the clocks returned to normal, the sounds returned to the world. The sky seemed stabilized. It was as if everything had been just a temporary rupture. But those who saw, those who felt, knew the veil had been torn. And the world was, little by little, being exposed to its truest and most spiritual version. And then came the early hours of April 17th. Satellites lost signal for 33 seconds. Exactly 33. A number laden with symbolism. The age of Christ at his death, the degrees of Freemasonry, the hidden steps of mystical wisdom. No one could explain the blackout. But after it, something had changed on Earth. People around the world began reporting visions even while awake. Not hallucinations. Visions, open skies, beings of light crossing fields. Clocks stopping at 3:33 a.m. Mirrors fogging up on their own, and when cleared, reflecting an image that wasn't the person's. Sounds coming from inside walls, sweet fragrances in the air with no visible source, and the constant feeling of being watched, not with malice, but with judgment. In this atmosphere, a group of archaeologists discovered in Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, a hidden cave that seemed intentionally protected by carved stones. Inside, an Aramaic inscription read, "The four have been released. The fifth will come on the wings of thunder." The text was ancient, and yet it's spoke of now. Many scholars began to speculate who were the four released, and who would be the fifth. Fallen angels, messianic signs, spiritual forces activated after centuries of dormancy. Meanwhile, in the sky over Turkey, a cloud formation clearly depicted a flaming sword. Thousands recorded the phenomenon, but the images vanished from the internet within minutes. Only one Russian channel broadcast it live and was taken off air shortly after. In the recording, a woman screamed in the background, "He's back, he's back!" No one knows for sure who she was talking about, but what was once treated as coincidence began to take on the contours of something greater. The scriptures seem to be fulfilling not in isolated events, but in a divine script now unfolding before our eyes. The feeling was that the world was already under judgment, not a sudden judgment, but a slow, spiritual, psychological one, as if God had stopped speaking aloud and started whispering within consciences. And when God's whisper echoes in the silence, even the most skeptical hearts tremble. We're no longer waiting for signs. They've already come. They've bled in the rivers, spoken in the skies, shaken the mountains. The earth is no longer the same because the invisible has touched the visible, and no one has emerged unscathed. In 2025, something supernatural will happen. But the most terrifying thing is that it's already started, not before the eyes, but within the souls. The world isn't ending, it's being revealed. And when everything is unveiled, what you'll see will be yourself before the eternal.